you are entering into the meeting, connecting to audio. As you come into the meeting, we welcome you, for one. And we also encourage you, so you don't need to worry about your audio being on, but we do encourage you to turn on your camera, because this is a meeting of our whole community, which is pretty great. We have a number of family members who are joining, a number of people who use our Christian Horizons services who are joining. We have, I don't know if we have any other guests today. No, we have no other guests today. Sometimes we've invited ministry folks or other people to speak, but we have our medical professional here to be able to share with us some of the updates on things that have happened within the different vaccines that are becoming available. I'm just taking up time while we welcome everyone in and people get their cameras on and settled. And I'll again remind you that you need not turn on, you don't have to worry about your mic because it'll remain muted, but you may, and we encourage you to turn on your camera so that we can just join together as a whole community. We're separate from each other sometimes. Oh my goodness, there's a baby. Oh, that's so lovely. Thank you, Laura Tupper. At least that's the name on your screen. This morning we were in a meeting and one of the persons in the meeting shared with us her hedgehog. Oh my goodness gracious, a small little hedgehog, and the thing is so very sweet. Oh, it was amazing. So I'll get started and I'll remind, so my name is Eugene Versteg and I serve as the Senior Vice President at Christian Horizons. This week I'll be welcoming you and starting our meeting off, and I'll turn our time over to Gregory Krunikin, who is an employee at Christian Horizons, studied as a nurse, and really has been doing an amazing amount of research for us to help us all understand some of the ongoing changes to the different vaccines that are available and some of the latest information there. On your screen, there's a ways that you can, in the top right-hand corner, different views that you could have to see all of the different people. Up at the top, there's a gallery view that allows you to see all of the people on the screen, which is pretty fantastic. We have 114 now, but 180 registered today, so that's fun. You can turn on the closed captioning or the live transcript, and if that helps you to be able to read the words that we're saying, you can see those. And there's a chat window as well. And I think if you open that chat, you can send chats directly to myself as one of the co-hosts, and that might make it easy. Then I can navigate those, receive those questions, and then as Greg's working through the material, we may be able to address those, but if we don't address them today, we can definitely put those onto future webinar times as well. We are planning to host another webinar next week, and I can talk about kind of why in a few moments. So welcome everyone, thank you for joining. We're going to spend about an hour going through this information. We'll have time together as a whole organization, people using services, family members, employees at Christian Horizons, and then we'll go into community breakout rooms where people will continue to learn more specific information related to your community. The reason for that is that as a sector, Christian Horizons is very involved in advocacy to continue to promote the necessity of people who use our services and our employees to receive the vaccines as soon as possible. So Gregory and I and Janet and a variety of other people sit on different committees that are happening across Ontario and Saskatchewan. And through that, we are connecting with the different politicians, our Minister of Children, Community and Social Services, the Minister of Social Services in Saskatchewan. We are connecting with Ministers of Health and other MPPs that are doing this work. We're connecting with some of the people on the vaccine rollout, the provincial vaccine rollout committees. We know that, and with local public health. So we have a number of people who we call outbreak managers within the organization who've been delegated to connect directly with local public health units and really to help them to understand the needs of the people that we support, the needs of our employees to receive the vaccine, and to get those vaccines quickly. This morning, and we meet regularly with our minister, some of the bureaucrats from the ministries. This morning we had a meeting with the Assistant Deputy Minister from the MCCSS, and part of that conversation includes them even asking us questions around, are there any public health units where you just need a little bit more support in helping them to navigate some of the guidance information? You can understand that the amount of guidance information that is out there and the overwhelming task that public health units have in trying to organize who is eligible, who is not eligible, is pretty significant. And so we've had situations where our staff have been turned away from receiving a vaccine. That was surprising to us. And we know that they probably should not have been turned away. And so we're advocating in those kinds of ways directly as well. At Christian Horizons, for people who use our services broadly, we're working together to encourage people to, if they need to, go and book your doctor's appointments now. Many have done so, some are still to do so, some won't need to. But if there's questions around whether or not the vaccine would be appropriate for me, now would be the time to, if you need your doctor to be a part of helping you to make that decision, now would be the time. We're also asking for our program managers, and we've equipped them to be able to do this, to connect with families and people who use services broadly to start to move toward providing those consent information as quickly as possible. Organizing those things, because what we're finding is that the public health units are saying, we're not available to support you, now's not the time, you need to wait, it's going to be a little bit later. And then all of a sudden they call and say, can you have your things organized by a couple of days from now? And so they're so very busy that really we want to have everything ready. And as soon as they respond to, because we're advocating, as soon as they respond to our request, we want everything to be ready and people to be scheduled and to be organized. For our employees, we're regularly sending out emails that have a link in them that say, can you share with us your name and some contact information, so that we can share those with public health as they request when it comes to organizing vaccinations for employees. There are some communities that that's exactly how they want it to happen. Other communities where they're saying, you can go onto a portal in your community and you can register yourself as somebody who works within developmental services or somebody who provides direct care to people in congregate settings. That's the language that the public health units are using. And so there's many employees that can go ahead and register themselves. What we're asking those to do is let your program manager know that you've done that, so that we can stop sending you those emails that encourage you to share your name with us. It also helps us to have a sense of what's the percentage of our employees who are saying, when the vaccine comes, I want to have it. So it helps us to understand the interest rate or the hesitancy rate that people have within the vaccines. That helps us even in thinking about how much education can we continue to provide? How can we allay some of those concerns that people have? We're also working together with the ministries to understand what are the implications for people in choosing whether or not to receive a vaccine. And so those are still somewhat unclear. And so we're also providing information to our employees these days to say, please let us know that you've gotten the vaccine. If you have, we'll add your name to our human resources information system. It'll be connected to you as an employee. And that way, later on, if there are implications for those who have or haven't received the vaccine, we can apply those correctly. And so it'll be very important for us to know when someone has been vaccinated. What we're going to look to have for that is you'll receive a paper copy or an emailed copy of confirmation of receiving it. And we'll want your program manager to have that in their hands, similar to when you were first hired at Christian Horizons and we had a criminal reference check. We don't need to keep it. We just want to have seen it in order to be able to confirm that that did happen. Greg's going to talk about some of the timing of second vaccines and those kinds of things today. So I'll turn it over to Gregory Krunikin, our healthcare managers, Healthcare Specialties Manager, and he'll share with you some of the latest news on the vaccines. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you very much, Eugene. I'm just going to get myself set up here and make sure I share my screen. Make sure I get the correct screen. There it is. Excellent. I'll bring up my copy. All right, we're good to go. So hello, everybody. It's been 2 weeks since we last had our last webinar, which is difficult to believe with the amount of information that has changed. And I guess happy 1-year anniversary of shutdowns in Ontario. I was watching a few things last night to a reminder that today was described as the darkest day in sports, as every single sporting major league was shut down on March 12th last year. So kind of crazy to think of how far we've come since then. And now we're going to be talking about the 3rd and 4th approved vaccines in Canada today. So it's kind of a crazy progression that's taken place in the past year for sure. To get started, I just want to go over a quick slide from last week, just as a reminder about what vaccines are doing for us. So this is our chain of infection slide that we had last week as well. And just a reminder really briefly to touch on this spot right here, which is the vaccine stop infection between the portal of entry and a susceptible host. So every time you're exposed to an illness or exposed to a pathogen of some sort, bacteria, a virus, anything like that, there's a possibility of becoming sick, but it's not 100%. Your body itself does have an immune system. It has barriers in place to prevent illness. So in order to become sick, you must be a susceptible host. And it's really important to kind of differentiate that, because what we see with COVID-19 is that a lot of people are actually susceptible hosts because we have no type of immunity around this type of virus yet. So what's the actual percentage of people who are susceptible hosts? We don't know. It kind of changes. If you think about some of those like early on cases of large weddings, large gatherings and such, it appeared to be maybe about 60%. But again, like that's not for sure. It's just kind of rough numbers. So we're going to be discussing the next 2 vaccines and how they work. But let's get started with the first one that was approved 2 weeks ago, AstraZeneca. So AstraZeneca received its approval 2 weeks now. And it has 2 different names that were approved in Canada that I want to go over quickly. There's the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine, not very original, and the Covishield is the other name for this vaccine. What's the difference between the 2? They're identical. The only difference is where they are produced. So the Covishield vaccine is actually produced by the Serum Institute in India, and that's its primary location, and it's using AstraZeneca's design for the vaccine in order to produce it. Okay, so that's why there's 2 different names. Currently, the doses that are available in Canada are the Covishield doses. That's the 500,000 that were delivered a couple weeks ago now, or a week and a half ago, and they will all be administered before the end of the month, which is exciting. The AstraZeneca vaccine is a 2-dose vaccine, and it's, oh, sorry, missed a point. It's been approved for everyone 18 years and older. NACI recommends ages 18 to 64, and that's the that's the approval committee for immunizations that gave that recommendation. So why was that recommendation made? So it's approved for 18 and older, but there's been a recommendation it's only 18 to 64 and 364 days. So as soon as you hit that magical 365th day, when you turn 65, you're no longer recommended to have access to this particular vaccine. The reason behind that is basically has to do with the research studies that AstraZeneca completed. The NACI was not while the research included individuals over the age of 65, the proportion of people over the age of 65 within the trials was not as high as the NACI would like to see. So as a result, and with the availability of many other vaccines that have lots of good data on people over the age of 65, that's where the recommendation for 18 to 64 came from. Does this mean that it would be dangerous for somebody over the age of 65 to have this vaccine or not as effective? Highly unlikely, but just because we don't have as much solid information as the recommendation committee would like, that is why we have that recommendation in place. It is a 2-dose vaccine, so very similar to the 2 mRNA vaccines that have already been approved. This one is recommended for between 3 and 4 months after the first dose, though. And we'll speak a bit more about dose intervals between vaccines in a later slide, because that's, of course, a big concern right now with the change in recommendations for all vaccines, but specifically the mRNA vaccines. Now, the efficacy rate for this vaccine in their trials was about 62%. That is still an excellent efficacy rate. And again, a reminder, that means a 62% chance of not developing any symptoms after an exposure to COVID-19 if you were already going to develop symptoms, if you were a susceptible host. So that is great news overall. And it's also important to note with this that the AstraZeneca vaccine had a similar effectiveness at preventing serious illness leading to hospitalization and preventing death as a result of COVID-19, which is pretty close to 100% prevention for both of those things, which again, phenomenal news. Overall, very, very good. So we're going to jump to my next slide here.
Gregory, what's
Yes.
NACI stand for?
I have it on a later slide, and I can't remember off the top of my head. It's the Advisory Committee on Immunizations. I think it's national is the first word, National Advisory Committee on Immunizations. I wasn't supposed to forget it on this slide, so. All right, the next dose up, or the next vaccine up that was approved, Johnson & Johnson, or the Janssen. So Janssen is the subsidiary, the secondary company owned by Johnson & Johnson. That's why you're going to see a mix of the two names within this. And it received its approval last week. And this one is recommended for anybody over the age of 18, including those 65 and older. So Johnson & Johnson, Janssen's clinical trials had significant involvement of people over the age of 65, which is why, again, the NACI was giving the thumbs up for recommendations for anybody over the age of 18. You'll notice I have many exclamation marks underneath the next point or by the next point, 1 dose. Fun fact, I've worked in healthcare for between my nursing education and working as a nurse before I came to Christian Horizons for over a decade. I've worked in emerge and infectious diseases, and I've done lots of weird things and seen lots of weird things, and I've been okay with that. But I don't like having medical procedures done to myself. So I am extremely excited about the Johnson & Johnson 1 dose, as it would require me only to get a shot 1 time. I have a bad tendency of passing out when needles are around myself. So this is a very exciting development, of course, in our battle against COVID-19. It's important to note that with both of these, though, any sort of immunity does not take place for about 2 weeks after receiving the vaccine, and that's to be expected. That's a normal reaction from a vaccine, or a normal time frame from any vaccine to build an immunity. And for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, we saw about a 66% efficacy rate. So again, a 66% reduction or prevention of any symptoms after exposure to COVID-19, if you were going to be a susceptible host anyways. And again, similar data with hospitalizations and death as a result of COVID-19 being significantly, drastically lessened as a result of the vaccine. Within all the trials that I've sort of read through, there's been no recorded hospitalizations and no recorded deaths as a result of COVID-19, which is phenomenal to hear. All right, so we've mentioned the past 2 vaccines are viral vector, but what does that actually mean? So I pulled this particular image just to kind of go over a few things quickly. There's 3 basic approaches to vaccine development that were taking place for COVID-19. There was a protein-based COVID-19 vaccine. We have not seen any of those come to market yet. Main reason behind that is proteins themselves are notoriously unstable or fragile and break down extremely quickly. It's very hard to keep them stabilized, similar to our mRNA, but that's one of the reasons why we haven't seen this particular vaccine come to market yet. And the way that would work is basically the injection has the spike protein within it, your body then builds immunity to it. Everything else that we've talked about so far for vaccines, including the adenoviruses, are basically trying to find a way of getting the spike protein into your system without exposing you to the actual virus in order for your body to build an immunity. That protein-based vaccines skip those extra steps and just give you the protein right away so you can build an immunity. But again, very unstable, very difficult to make a vaccine out of, and as a result, we haven't seen that come to market yet. We have the mRNA vaccine, which is the one at the bottom there, which of course are Moderna and our Pfizer vaccines. And those ones basically have the code for the spike protein that they give to your body into the cells so that they can read that code and produce that protein. Viruses themselves cannot replicate, they cannot produce the parts that they need in order to become a new copy of themselves. They need to hijack our system in order to do that. So that's one of the reasons it's difficult to make the protein-based ones in the first place. Now, for the adenovirus, the adenoviral vectors. So viral vector vaccines, basically what they do is they take the gene for the spike protein. So we basically early on, within the month of the coronavirus pandemic, the gene was sequenced for COVID-19, like the entire genome. So we were aware that this particular gene makes this particular spike antigen, which is great and really effective way of making sure that we're able to fight off COVID-19 or give us a tool. What we do with that gene is we take that and put it inside, I say we, but it's obviously not myself, into an adenovirus. An adenovirus is the same type of virus that causes a common cold. There's hundreds of adenoviruses, many and most of them won't cause an infection in humans, and that's the same with a particular adenovirus that's being used for these vaccines, both the Johnson & Johnson and the AstraZeneca vaccine. And the gene from that spike protein is put into the adenovirus, and that is the delivery method for that gene to your cells. Once the adenovirus is released, is in your body, it connects with cells, and when it connects with your cells, it releases that gene, and that gene gives your body the instructions to produce the spike protein. Okay, production of that spike protein, our immune system kicks in, and that's how we build an immunity. Now, adenoviruses have been around for an exceptionally long time, and they're decades-old technology. And one of the more recent and significant adenovirus vaccines was actually the Ebola vaccine that was developed a few years ago during that Ebola outbreak.
Gregory, I'm pretty sure that either in a few moments or maybe now, but that you've got some information to share with people about the AstraZeneca vaccine, because of some of the decisions that have been made in some of the European countries. So just to let people know, we have some information that we understand from Canada around why maybe they're choosing to not pause that vaccine yet. So we'll share some of that. And I have a few other questions that are coming in from people that we may be able to address.
Perfect. And as I mentioned, Eugene, I do have a number of questions were submitted prior to the talk today that I have a final slide on with a large Q&A. So hopefully we cover a lot of them, but of course, if we have extra time, let's make sure we attack as many of those we possibly can. And I will specifically speak to what's going on in some of the European countries with the AstraZeneca vaccine, absolutely. So I just want to go over viral vector vaccine safety. This is again coming directly from Health Canada's resources and their sites. Both the AstraZeneca and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines we're seeing in their trial periods, mild to moderate side effects, most commonly pain at the injection site, body chills, feeling tired, and feeling feverish. And of course, there is the adverse events following immunization reporting that is taking place for all of the COVID-19 vaccines. Any vaccine and any medication ever developed has this similar sort of tracking system for adverse events in order to make sure there's no differences in the general population. Again, I haven't mentioned the AstraZeneca specific concerns that are coming out of Europe right now, because we're going to talk about that on a separate slide, which isn't quite yet. So the next thing I want to mention was vaccine safety. This is similar to a couple weeks ago. I shared this slide that you'll see on the left of your screen there from February 24th with the total number of adverse events following immunization that were reported at 443. That is now up to 665, but you'll also see a significant change in the total doses that have been administered, which is the red circles. So back on February 24th, 556,000 doses. This is unfortunately Ontario-specific information. I should specify that. Saskatchewan, I'm having more difficulty finding this particular information. I'm sure it exists, and if anybody in Saskatchewan has access to that, I'd really appreciate you emailing me that. And then compared to now, March 6th, we've actually seen 890,000 doses. I realize that's about a week old. That's the last time they updated the adverse events following immunizations. It's typically updated every week to 10 days. And I can say now that in Ontario, over 1 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines have been administered. That includes both first and second doses. And we're seeing a fairly consistent number kind of coming out with the total proportion of people right around that 2% mark. And of those 2% people, 2% of people who receive vaccines who are reporting an adverse event, we're seeing about 1.6 in 100,000 of those being serious. Of course, I did read again today just to double check, and a lot of those, like the serious outcomes from these are acute kidney injury. Is one person in Ontario has had like an acute kidney injury. There have been no deaths linked specifically to any of the COVID-19 vaccines that have been administered so far. And another quick number there for everybody, in Saskatchewan, total vaccinations as of March 11th was 95,000, just shy of 96, and they're averaging about 1,500 a day. In Ontario, we're averaging close to 33,000 a day now. So that's excellent news. And the goal for Ontario, again, is to get that up to 150,000 in the next little bit. And it's going to be important that we do so, as you'll see in a later slide, where I'm going to go over the vaccine expectations in the next few weeks. All right, AstraZeneca, what's going on? So there's been a few countries in Europe specifically, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland, that have put a suspension or a hold on administering the AstraZeneca vaccine. Why? So there's been 1 million doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine that have been administered within Europe. From those 1 million doses, there's been 4 cases of thrombosis, which is blood clots or blood clotting, within 2 weeks of receiving the AstraZeneca vaccine. And that is, as you can see below there, a 0.0004% chance of a thrombosis event within 2 weeks of receiving the AstraZeneca vaccine. I will mention that of those 4 cases, 2 people did unfortunately die from typically a pulmonary embolism, which is when a clot releases from somewhere else in your body and travels to your lung and causes a very significant medical event, obviously, that leads to death. So the question that needs to be asked now, and the reason these countries have put this on pause is, are the vaccines causing this to happen? Or is it the normal prevalence of blood clots or the normal rate at which blood clots occur in the population? What is important to note is that the rate of the instance of thrombosis, or the number of cases of thrombosis that have occurred, appear to be exactly the same as what we expected in the general population. With that considered, the EU, the European Union, is still recommending AstraZeneca be utilized and is not concerned by this information because, again, the way we check and see if something is causative for vaccines is this happening at the same rate or at an expedited rate, like more often than what would be expected in the normal population who has not received a vaccine. So I don't want to like take away from this case or this whatsoever. This is the information as to what's happening and why it's happening. Of course, Canada is going to be looking at this information as well at this time, because there's been, again, that there's no increase in risk. It doesn't appear to be of having blood clots. It seems to be the same risk as the general population. That is why it's not being stopped currently in Canada. I can't speak for Health Canada, of course. I'm just kind of giving you guys the information that I have from what's happening in Denmark, Norway, and Iceland. All right, so here we go with the National Advisory Committee on Immunizations, 34616. What's going on with all the dosing intervals? So approval has expanded time between the second doses of vaccines up to 4 months. You'll notice I say vaccines there, not just mRNA. That's actually every vaccine on Ontario that is currently available: Moderna, Pfizer, and the AstraZeneca vaccine. The second dose has been expanded to that 4-month window. How did they come to this conclusion? Why did we come to this conclusion? So what's happening is the advisory committee is actively following studies that are currently at the 2-month mark following a single dose of the mRNA vaccines. The AstraZeneca vaccine is unique. It actually shows better efficacy in the research trials at the 12 to 16 week mark for the second dose, but the mRNA ones, of course, are the ones everybody's concerned about, with the recommendations originally being 3 to 4 weeks after initial doses. So the advisory committee is following these 2-month studies that are going to continue on up to the 4-month mark. and actually further with only a single dose of the mRNA vaccine. What they're finding is at the 2-month mark, those who received the COVID-19, like one dose of the mRNA vaccine, have a 70 to 80% efficacy against COVID-19, which is still an excellent number and is great when you look at AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson. Even if at the low end at 70%, we're still looking at a higher efficacy rate from one dose of the mRNA vaccine than either of the AstraZeneca or the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. What another piece of information that's really important is that very early on, it was reported that after a single dose of the mRNA vaccines, there was about a 50% efficacy rate. The reality, though, is that it's actually closer to 92%. And the reason there was that huge discrepancy is that in the initial research trials, Pfizer and Moderna both looked at people who received the vaccine from day 1 after the vaccine was received up to day 14 and going out past that. That 0 to 14 days greatly skewed the data down to have a lower efficacy rate, as we would expect. We don't expect efficacy or immunity to build for upwards of 2 weeks after receiving a vaccine. So if we take away that information, that 0 to 14 days, and we just look at the 14 days going forward, we can say that at the 2-week mark after receiving your first COVID-19 mRNA vaccine, there's a 92% efficacy rate. And then as we go out to that 2-month mark, it can drop anywhere to 80 to 70%, which again is an expected curve for immunizations. The goal with this it's going to drastically increase first dose vaccines for absolutely everyone in Canada. And what we actually will see in the next little bit, and I just pulled the last week of March because this is when the numbers start to get really exciting and grow significantly, is that in Saskatchewan, they will receive 60,000 doses of between Pfizer and Moderna in the last week of March. In Ontario, we expect over 750,000 doses in 1 week for both of these vaccines. And that doesn't include Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca. Those numbers climb through April and continue to climb through May. This could drastically move up the vaccination schedule to the point that based on the current projections for deliveries, everybody could receive a first dose of COVID-19 vaccine by June. Now, I don't want to speak for Health Canada. I'm not making their predictions for them. But based off of the schedule that they've released and the delivery schedule that's been released for the vaccines, that we'd have enough doses in the country by June for anybody who wants one, for at least a first dose. Now, of course, they haven't updated that to any. They haven't updated saying that's the goal or anything. It's also going to have to do with how many vaccines they can get into arms, of course. But again, something to look for and monitor. And I think I'll kind of like close that up with the argument being made that 2 people with 80% or 70% efficacy compared to 1 person with 94, 95 is better overall for the population. And again, this is just what they have found. And another really important thing to remember with this is because the information only goes up to the 2-month mark right now, that is, those research studies are being closely followed by this advisory committee. And if there's any reduction in the efficacy rate past the 2-month mark, if it significantly drops off in the next week, 2 weeks, month, they're going to change these recommendations again. All right, so it's quite possible we see this shrunk back down to maybe, let's say, a 2-month interval or a 3-month interval, or it could actually expand up to a 6-month interval if they actually show better efficacy as a result. The second dose of a vaccine is always a booster. The first dose allows your immune system to spike, to start to build an immunity. The second dose gives it that kind of bump up to a really, really effective rate. So that's kind of where we're at with these. I hope that kind of explains it fairly well. And if not, maybe Eugene can explore that a bit more if there's any specific questions around that. All right, my lightning round of questions. These are all questions that were submitted by people who are hopefully here today, or at least they were submitted when they registered for the webinar. So how many vaccines are currently available and what is in them? So currently there are 4 vaccines approved in Canada. There's only 3 though that have actually made it into market. So that's the Moderna, Pfizer, and the AstraZeneca. When is Johnson & Johnson getting here? Hard to say. The way that Canada negotiated all their contracts for vaccines is on a quarterly basis. So every 3 months, there's an expected amount of vaccine to be delivered. It doesn't have to be broken down to a week-by-week basis. Technically, if we have an order for 10 million Johnson & Johnson vaccines by the end of Q2, which is June, all of them could be delivered on the last day of June, and they still meet their contract. So it's hard to say exactly when to expect those, but we'll see them in the near future. As for what is actually in them, we covered the mRNA vaccines last week. I would really encourage folks to go to the Health Canada site that covers each one of the vaccines, and they have the ingredient list for each one of them on there. There's a lot of technical names that I don't pronounce very well that I'm going to try and avoid pronouncing on the webinar. So will people who use services have an extended second dose? This is a really important question. We talked about the extended dose, why it's happening. To my understanding, yes. I know there is recommendations around certain protected classes, those over the age of 80 who are in long-term care, that will still receive their second dose in the original recommended time frame. Advocacy is taking place, I can say that. We are regularly talking to public health units, and as we know more, we will share this information. Another really important question that we've covered many times before, but there's been a slight change coming out in the research. Vaccines prevent you from getting sick. How does this help those who cannot be vaccinated? So absolutely, the conversation around this has been that we know vaccines prevent you from getting ill. We don't know if it prevents you from having a high enough viral load to cause an infection to somebody else. There's actually a lot of research being done right now, and initial research from Pfizer and Moderna trials are actually showing a reduction in transmission of 80%, and that's at the low end. So that's phenomenal news. So there might actually be some protection to others if you receive a vaccine. Now, again, that's a really tough question to research. It's still being actively researched, and both of those studies are still working on finishing up to be published, but it's, again, initial findings. If we qualify to get a vaccine, but we live in a different health unit, so this is for employees mostly, where do we go for the vaccine? Do we go to the health unit that we live in? Do we go to the health unit where we work at? Great question. I can speak specifically that I've been on a few calls from health units where they've discussed this, and they are actually opening up to anybody within their jurisdiction that qualifies to receive the vaccine. So not where you work, but where you live. But again, every health unit can be a little bit different. So that's a question that should be asked when we register to get a vaccine, of course, although I don't believe you'll be turned away if you meet the criteria. So registration for those living in congregate settings. This was a question based around like who is registering people who live in congregate care. Is it in one of the homes for Christian Horizons? Is it Christian Horizons, or is it, oh, I'm so sorry. Is it Christian Horizons, or is it family members? Christian Horizons is reaching out to the health units to coordinate all of that, so you don't have to worry about that if the loved one is living with us. If someone who lives in Christian Horizons home is currently living with family and receives a vaccine, will they still need to isolate for 2 weeks when returning? Again, another great question. Affects a lot of people, of course. We have to follow the recommendations from the MCCSS, of course, and currently they have no instruction around what to do once people receive vaccines. We expect more guidance to come out in the very near future because, of course, as more and more access to vaccines are available, we'll need more instruction on what to do. So as soon as we have that information, we'll share that. Next up, should I get one of the vaccines if, and I left a blank there just to kind of fill in the general questions of if I have an autoimmune disease, if I'm pregnant, if I'm taking a specific medication, all very, very important questions to ask. And I would really encourage everyone to reach out to their healthcare teams. That includes family doctors, nurse practitioners, or in the case of medication interactions, I would actually reach out to your pharmacist. They are absolutely the experts when it comes to medications and interactions, and that's who I would go to. So when will people who use services have access to a vaccine? It's different in all health units. Some health units we've already had access, other health units we haven't quite had access yet. General rule of thumb, phase 2 is when we expect to see access in both Ontario and Saskatchewan. It's 2A, but in phase 2, which is expected to start in April. So if that's gives a rough idea of when we're expecting to see access. And then when can we return to life as we love it? I'm stealing that quote from Janet. I'm going to use it until the end of time. And that is basically when can we return to like engaging community events and that sort of thing. And again, we're waiting on instruction from the ministry, from public health on when restrictions can be reduced. And of course, we have that color tiered system and we can still abide by that. And we'll kind of wait as we hear more information. When will direct support professionals have access to vaccinations? A lot already have or have been able to at least register, which is fantastic news in local health units. I can assure you that the teams that are reaching out to the health units are constantly in contact with them, and maybe harassing is a strong word, but definitely making our voices heard that we would like access as soon as possible and that we meet criteria. Essential visitors, I've been receiving this question quite a bit. So those who are deemed essential visitors, when will we have access to vaccines? I don't know quite yet. We have one health unit in Ontario that has opened up a little bit more for essential visitors, although I understand they actually kind of pulled back a bit recently. So we are advocating at the provincial level to have more access for those who are essential visitors. But at this time, we are not sure if and when that criteria will come into place. So when will anyone with an intellectual and developmental disability have access? Not just those who live in congregate care. So not just those who are supported or not supported, sorry, who access Christian Horizons services. And the answer to that one is phase 2. It very clearly outlines that developmental services, but also those with pre-existing medical conditions will have access to vaccinations. And how does that compare in Ontario to other provinces and Saskatchewan to other provinces? Pretty consistent across the board. And finally, when can visits take place, and does that change with vaccines? So currently visits can take place in a number of our locations following the recommendations that are in place from the ministry, MCCSS, around visits depending on the color zone your local public health unit is in. And does it change once we're all vaccinated? It will. I'm confident that it will, but I don't know what that looks like yet. We don't know what that looks like yet as we still await instruction from the ministry. And Eugene, that is my lightning round of questions. Do we have a few more we want to cover quickly, or are we looking to break out into our...
I think you covered most all of them. There's a couple of questions that have come to me and to others around people's autoimmune disorders and concerns around the blood clots and those kinds of things. And I'd say generally, and you can add to this, we've been asking people to go and have those conversations with doctors. It would be, inappropriate and impossible for us to recommend whether or not a vaccine is appropriate. And certainly that conversation with your doctor who knows your medical history well and knows the makeup of the vaccines could help you to make those decisions. I thought I would say that. I think you answered the question around, group visits and vaccines, and maybe I'll underscore that by, again, this is a conversation that we're regularly having with our two ministries in Ontario and in Saskatchewan, asking them about the guidance that they've given us and the guidelines that we need to follow. Those adjust from time to time, and they're slightly different in different communities based on the level, so the color coding of the province. There is a color coding of the province, and then our responsibility within that color coding is slightly enhanced beyond those. Those are our guidance. So the idea that there are visits available within someone's home who lives in a group home setting, a visit available for a person who uses our services to go home to their family, those things are available, and there are guidelines for those things that we just simply need to follow, given our relationship and responsibility to the ministry. Another question maybe, and I think we've answered it before, but it's probably worthwhile answering always, is if I receive the Pfizer vaccine in the first dose, would I receive a second one and a second dose? And I'll add to that question, or a different vaccine in my second dose. And then I'll add to that question by saying, do I have a choice as to which vaccine I might receive?
Absolutely. So right now, if you receive whichever vaccine you receive first is the vaccine you will receive as your second dose. There's been no research done between mix and matching the current vaccines that are available, and I don't expect we'll ever see that research take place, simply because access is going to open up significantly in the next little bit, and supply. So If you receive Pfizer first round, you'll get Pfizer for your second dose. Moderna, AstraZeneca, same thing. And the second part to that, Eugene, sorry.
Can I choose which vaccine I'd like to have?
Right now, my understanding is no. The way that is set up is if you are going to a location, if you are able to go to a vaccination location, you are going to receive the Pfizer vaccine because it is so difficult to transport that particular vaccine. If the vaccine is being brought to you, then you're looking more than likely at the Moderna vaccine. And of course, if you're going to a pharmacy in one of the approved locations, you'll be getting access to the AstraZeneca vaccine. So that's currently the way it's set up. And I did see a question come through as well about the variants, and I can't believe I didn't speak about the variants this time around and what looks like for those. So it's important to note that both the Johnson & Johnson and the AstraZeneca vaccines were both tested in locations with variants circulating, and that the efficacy rates came out of that were the 62 and 66%, which is great news and would suggest fairly significant protection against the variants. The Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines were initially tested before the variants really became a major factor. And what we're seeing in real world data now is still a fairly significant protection level against the variants themselves. So that's also great news.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, Greg, for sharing all of that. We will break into our community meetings now. One thing I'll remind people is that we do record all of these webinars. We do post all of these recordings onto our Christian Horizons website. And so you can go right on the website. On the top of the website is a banner that says, for more resources on COVID, click here. In the chat, I added the Health Canada or the Canada Public Health Services link for that Gregory spoke to, so that you can do a little bit of your own research as well. And so now I'll turn it to the local executive directors and your communities to learn more about what the specific rollout plans are for there. Thank you, everyone. At the end of the time, when you've met together in your community, you can just leave the meeting by, I think it says leave meeting, not just leave breakout room, and have a wonderful weekend. Enjoy what I'm experiencing in my community as sunshine and wind. And so thank you for joining us for this time again today. Take good care.